I'd like to welcome our guest tonight. We're delighted to have Jill Hoy, who is Jon Imber's wife and an artist in her own right, very successful artist, and Chris Crossman. Chris wrote the essay for the catalog, which we have available up here. It's a beautiful catalog for the exhibition. He is the former director of the Farnsworth Museum in Rockland, Maine, and he's also the founding chief curator for the Crystal Bridges Art Museum in Arkansas. So we're very excited to have Chris talk about Imber's work, and he wrote a wonderful essay for the catalog. So I'm going to just keep the introductions brief. We do have some cake and drinks. If you are thirsty, feel free to have a shot. And I'm going to turn it over to Jill. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. We're going to try to keep this relatively informal and conversational. And if people have questions, we don't mind if you just sort of shout them out or whatever. But just to say that Jon Imber has been an artist that I've followed for most of my past 35 years or so, while I've been in Maine and even elsewhere. So this is a real honor to have this to be involved with this exhibition, which is a kind of survey of some of the light work. Is that? Yeah. There are a few early ones, but we can talk about those, and maybe just move quickly to this first slide. If it's, yeah. Lilies and Mums in 2013. This is probably one of the last abstract outdoor type works that he did, Joe?
He did it in the studio from a bouquet of lilies, and with left-handed, he had switched over. So it is the last in this show.
Right.
He had ALS towards the end of his life, and he was forced to switch from a right hand to a left hand, which he thoroughly embraced its crudeness, which he was always looking for an authenticity and muscularity in his work. And so this would be a beautiful example of it.
He also, towards the end, was doing portraits of friends and people he knew. Yeah,
we had a mentor who helped us, compassionate care at ALS, Ron Hoffman, who helped us through those that last year and a half. And Ron had said at one point, Jon, you're not going to have the energy to say goodbye to people multiple times. How do you want to deal with that? And Jon said, well, I'll do portrait sessions and invite people to sit for me. And they were comedy. You know, Jon would have been a vaudeville star had he been born in his father's generation, and really loved an audience and loved to perform. And they ended up being stellar sessions of his humor. And as it went on, his courage, I mean, all the way through, the courage was present. They were miraculous sessions because he really could do very little. And he just tapped into that river that you're in painting, and well, I could go on and on about that, but we don't have to do it.
Yeah, I love this painting for a lot of reasons, but one of the most striking things to me is there's a degree of uncontrol and control, you know, that's present there. And I was maybe talk about this a little bit more later, but I was fascinated to learn he grew up on Long Island, down near the South Shore, Bellport, Jones Beach. You know, I think the light is a Long Island light. It's moist, it's blanching. Yeah, but that's just me. I don't really have any way to back that up. Let's go on to this other slide. Maybe a bit happier moment. But can you tell us how you two met?
I was painting in Ken Stinson's field midway down Deer Isle, and Jon and Lubosh were driving down the island, and he said to Lubosh, turn around, I'm going to meet that woman in that field. And he did. He tracked me down and figured out who I was and came started courting me. Yeah. And they were all painting. They were all painting dates. Yeah.
Did you
But there, yes.
go to Carl Schrag's place? And
Yeah.
I mean, he was a
So
character
that
too.
was the next segue after spotting me painting in the field. I'm a plein air painter half the year. Was at the end of every summer, Carl Schrag, who's a fabulous painter, printmaker, and of which there were many really wonderful artists on Deer Isle at that period. Carl would have an end of the season expose of all his work, and he'd invite curators and artists and friends. And they were really wonderful gatherings in a very European way. He, one by one, put them up. And that's where I met Jon. And the famous line was, I said, oh, I always wanted an old house with an apple tree. And Jon thought I said, I was looking for a man. Jon always heard what he wanted to hear.
Yeah, I remember that apple tree, and Carl painted it over and over again,
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
He was a really interesting artist whose work is in major museum collections around the country. One of his own self-portraits, which is, he was really best known as a printmaker, but it's a self-portrait and etching that is remarkable. It's at the Museum of Modern Art, I think. So, and the painting on the left, your left in the audience, would be Jill's. And it struck me because it's so unlike a lot of your work. You know, it's you know, it's not monochromatic, but it doesn't have the jumble of color. And
Right.
it's
an early gouache from
yeah.
the early 80s. And I didn't have a car at that point. I'd bike out places. So gouache, just opaque watercolor. It's very portable. And,
Yeah. I think the quality of not only the light, but just the air, it's kind of a moist air. And we can talk about this too, and you can tell me I'm completely wrong, but I think one of the things you gave Jon was this sense of air in his work.
yeah, I had to agree with that.
So let's move on a little bit. These are two very different paintings, but and one of which is the one on the right, Deer Isle Thoroughfare, is in the exhibition, and it's a classic Jon Imber landscape from that period, late 90s, early 2000s, I guess. But the one on the left is a painting that refers to Jon's early life as an art student, I guess. And for a while, he was a preparator. That is, he was hanging art for museums at Harvard and perhaps elsewhere. I really don't know that much about that part of his career. But I guess you could say that that is probably one of the best preparations for a painter you can have. Your nose is 2 inches from a Titian. It's how you get to know what the quality of paint it really is all about, as well as the art history, I suppose, that goes with that.
Jon worked at the Fog, and he got to touch paintings after hours and really come up close to them. And this is a Botticelli in this particular case that he's helping hang. And he also was an art mover for the Rockefellers, and got to move a lot of great art. And he always was a lover of art history, making it his own in a contemporary way. So he would just weave back and forth through history. Yeah,
we have some slides we'll show you. The question was about Philip Guston, who he studied with, and was one of the artists that Jon was very devoted to, I guess, throughout his life, really. And who took Guston to different places than might be expected of some other artists. I was going to ask you, Jill, about a lot of his early paintings, figurative paintings. The bodies are, somewhat distorted. The head is bigger than it should be. Is there any reason for that, or
that character, who's somewhat demonic, somewhat playful, was like an alter ego of Jon's. He was often a green-headed man, huge head, and big hands, small body, big feet. And he reoccurred throughout this early period, which was highly iconic, psychological. Guston always stressed that you should do the most profound paintings possible, the toughest. He didn't want to see plein air. He didn't want anything realistic. He wanted you to go to your deepest archetypal places and work from them. And so these early paintings of Jon's were, they're fabulous paintings. And that's what really hit the art world big time at a time that was coming out of abstract expressionism, was not too friendly towards figuration, but it was, and Nina Nielsen, one of the best gallery really in Boston, picked him up at that point and was showing these. And that's very much a direct extension of having worked with Guston, is him delving into his family life, and they're very autobiographical. Yeah,
what Imber did, which is kind of interesting, is he started with the figure and some pretty direct references to what Guston was preaching, I guess, at the time. But then he goes to the Deer Isle thoroughfare, and he goes deep there too, I think, in ways that are pretty remarkable. There's a little patch of color over here, which is almost like a painting within a painting.
The roof.
And it sort of anticipates the later abstractions, in my mind, at least. I'm probably making that up. But.
Well, the little Courbet red rock to the right of that,
oh, yeah.
Courbet always put, not Courbet, Corot always put a tiny red dot of cadmium in his paintings. There's so many art historical references in many of these paintings, both in here and throughout Jon's life, because he totally hats off to art history with a great love of it.
Yeah, well, there are any number of artists who kind of bounce back and forth from different artists that they admire and love, but Jon did it in such a way that, as you were saying, he went deep with these things, and he made them different. He made them his own, I think, more so than most things. I was going to ask you about that little red rock. Can you tell us about the cadmium?
Yeah. So Jon, I don't know if Philip Guston knew he was going to, that his life would be fairly short after teaching at BU. He didn't, he lived, I don't know, 5 more years maybe. But he met Jon and he just poured himself into Jon. They had a very close relationship, and Jon was a great recipient of that relationship. And so when Philip died, Musa, his wife, called Jon up and said, Jon, the studio is full of paint and Belgian linen and brushes. Come up here, take it. And it would just seem sacrilegious to Jon at that point. His heart couldn't bear it. So he didn't do it. And when Musa, the wife, died, Musa, the daughter, called Jon up and said, Jon, it's time, come up. And so he and I went up to Woodstock, and Jon, there's just amazing amounts of art supplies, and he's filling bags with all these colors that came in boxes, and cobalt violet and all these colors. So he left the white because that's the least expensive, and he took all the color. And we get back to Boston and he starts opening them up, and they're all cadmium red, which Guston was terrified to run out of. And it's quarried in Russia, and there had been a closing down of the color, plus it's lethal. And so anyway, we have a lot of cadmium red from Guston, which he would carefully dole out to painters he felt were worthy.
Yeah, and it to me at least, it's the exact shade of tiger lilies, almost.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
have
it
to
is.
do a little mixing, but, and it does appear in a lot of John's paintings and
Yeah,
other things.
you're right. That's a nice accent to that.
Let's see, where are we?
One below it.
Yeah. Here's another, and I guess this is one of the early, well, this is the earliest painting in this exhibition. Its title is Gear. And it's literally a gear, but also I guess it references different kinds of equipment that you might find, tucked away.
Yeah, he was looking at a lot of docks and all the stuff. It's at the back of the detritus of a fishing world. And he loved Stuart Davis and Leger. And, this was one excellent example. And he was looking at a lot at Picasso Cubism and just kind of making it, loving those periods of art history. He always had art books open at his table and would just, artists are famous for plundering and lineages. And it's always interesting to look at what the lineages of influence are. And this is a beautiful example of his communication with Leger.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to have not simply plundered, but he seemed to have worked his way through the history of art, and the artists that interested him kind of stayed with him in different ways, even in the late work, I think. And the organization of the space, the push and the pull of the kind of shallow space in this particular work, which echoes the Leger. And Leger was doing it at a different time and different moment. But,
as well as Hans Hofmann was another love of his, and the dark outlines, and even I was going to say, well, go ahead.
no, that's okay.
Hans Hofmann, that push-pull, it was also an early influence of John's spatially. John only basically looked with one eye. He had an eye that would turn when he was exhausted. And so I've always been fascinated. These are very spatial paintings and they're constructs because he really couldn't see space, but he learned to build space. And because if you're monocular, you tend not to see space, which is an amazing factor because these are very spatial paintings.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see, this must be the same one. Where are we? Yeah. And here's another one of John's paintings, the mussels over on the wall, which is much larger than I had imagined it. It's really a spectacular painting. And the Marston Hartley next to it is actually a very small painting. But I think you see some of the movement that sort of interested John in his painting. That's at least seems indirectly kind of referring to Marston Hartley.
He loved Hartley. And, another Guston story would be, Guston said, well, paint like if you're going to do a sign for a steak or a pork chop, make it like just as simple and as bold as you can, which Hartley certainly did, is a good example of that. And it may be one of the reasons why John gravitated to Hartley, for its power, its directness, its rawness, and its real emotional ropes that went into Maine. And I was always, John was somewhat resistant to Maine, but he really got it in this totally visceral, like his emotional connection in his paintings. I always feel John's paintings powerfully, and I think everybody does. This one was done in the studio from smaller paintings that were done on site. He really started, it was a whole period where he was doing shells washed up on beaches and almost as still lives of the shore life in close up and building them into these big piles, which is also very Guston-y, these piles of limbs, or which we'll get to. But
Yeah, shorelines, I think, are a theme in, well, your work too, for that matter.
Yeah, I love how this one looks like an ear on the side. You
Yeah,
know, they certainly transcend the shore.
Right, yeah. And what initially caught my attention were the clouds, that these just little patches of paint. And not unlike the Hartley, although Hartley's clouds are a lot darker, and his life at that point was kind of unraveling too. So that was, you know, as you were saying, kind of an emotional dark painting, whereas John's painting is muscular, but it's not it's not a depressed kind of muscularity, sort of celebratory. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, so we're back to one of John's figurative paintings, which actually is at the Farnsworth Museum, and it's called Lincoln. I'm assuming it's a reference to Abe Lincoln.
And the town of Lincoln.
And the town of Lincoln. That's what I really was wondering about. Yeah.
I think he liked the double play.
Yeah.
And the profundity and the wasteland. And, you know, there's a lot of post-Civil War austerity.
Right. And Gusson is people have been talking about recently, since the exhibition of Gusson's work is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and was postponed because I guess the National Gallery was concerned it was going to upset people with the imagery of the KKK figures, the Ku Klux Klan, which came actually from Gusson's own youth and growing up in Los Angeles, where an exhibition where his work was, when he was very, very young, you know, just a student, was literally attacked by the KKK, and it never went away from him. And he was certainly among, you know, the few artists of his generation that have sort of addressed these sort of social issues at that particular moment in time. And I think that John's painting, well, it might be a particularly dreary day in Lincoln, Maine, might also have something to do with that sort of social consciousness. And another Maine artist was Eastman Johnson, who did this veteran and well, not necessarily a Civil War veteran, but one thinks of the returning farmers from the Civil War and the scythe, the reaper's scythe, which Homer also painted, which had to do with the terrible loss of young men at the end of the Civil War, and also to some extent renewal, which I also think is in John's work too. You know, the sky is lightening in the distance here.
This is an enormous painting, the Lincoln one. Really, it's an enormous painting. The scale of these landscapes, which he started to do. You know, John really had different periods of evolution, and once he had something he was familiar with, he was off pushing into new territory. So after those iconic ones, he started at some point doing chalk pastels and working them in the studio into giant landscapes. And this is one of them. And then after that, he moved into figures that he was carrying over his back, also monumental. He never had problem with his ego. So these were, you know, you had to do huge paintings, and these are fairly small compared to some intended for New York. Yeah. And museums.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the Farnsworth was fortunate to pick this up when it did. And it's interesting, this was right at the beginning of when what came to be called the new landscape painting was coming into its own in the art world. And John sort of anticipated that as much as anyone did, and you too, for that matter. Let's look at, oh, yeah. So Embers Hill. Can you tell us about
Yeah,
that?
this painting right here, which is just an amazing painting. His uncle Isaac owned a place in upstate New York in Chatham, and John, someday I would love to see a show, a museum show of all the Chatham paintings, because for every year he would go to Chatham, and it basically tracked his life evolution as a painter on this same hill, either down in the valley or looking across it. Jackie was a farmer, big farmer there, and it was his touchstone spot, particularly before he met me, and onward through our marriage, he would always go back here. And this was done shortly after going to Ireland. He had a fellowship there. He was very sick when he got there, running a raging fever, and he was determined in this month we were there to do his paintings. So he mixed up big bowls of paint and wide brushes and did the de Kooning, who he had always adored. And just, it freed him. It broke him into a whole other realm of painting it just freed him. And this is a beautiful example of, it's a magnificent painting.
Yeah, you've talked about this, in terms of his later work in the abstractions, that he kind of liked to be a little bit out of control.
Yes.
And that painting especially, I think, kind of sets that.
Well, that he had such knowledge and expertise, and to throw it, he liked being iconoclastic and funny and throwing seriousness in some ways out the door while being extremely eloquent. It's a beautiful example of eloquence and freedom and of great knowledge. And he called those vertical horizontals, where your road is going away from you, but it's actually going up a hill. And so it's.
Yeah, it's almost as though you're at the top of a ridge about to go down that hill. And
You
then,
are,
and
yes.
then shoot back up.
Yeah, exactly.
And in my own, for fevered imagination, I imagine John as a kid riding a bike on that road and being literally out of control, where his parents might have had,
Their
palpitations.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful painting, beautifully done. And it does really evoke what de Kooning was doing in the mid 80s. He didn't do a lot of landscape paintings, but he sort of melded the landscape with the human figure, the nude, which was his primary subject matter for most of his life. And it's that same kind of lack of control, but he, everything there kind of connects and works together in a way visually that only an artist that has been doing that for 50 or 60 years probably could pull off with that facility. One thing I wanted to ask you about was, did John ever talk about like process? Was he interested in, how to begin a painting? What happens next? When do you end a painting?
Well, it's more about the journey. He would launch in. There's a wonderful movie called Embers Left Hand that Maine Masters did, and there's a kind of cool scene in there where John addresses some of this. But I really recommend it to all of you. It's funny and it's a great art movie and human movie. But I think he would launch into them, and then at some point, maybe an hour in, he'd flip them over. He'd turn them upside down, because having a dynamic struggle in the process was crucial to him to trust the painting. And so he'd flip them and keep painting, and it would just give this ground of juicy whatever to push into and somehow sort out. So they really should work in any direction, and you can get a whole different painting by flipping any of these, and he did all the time. And so sometimes you'll see drips that go sideways. It was in that direction at that point.
Did he use different size brushes?
Yeah.
To get some of the effects, like some of the abstractions where there are these wide swaths of paint, and then there are thinner spots. And also, for the life of me, I'm not a painter, but I cannot figure out how you could layer something like that and keep it from turning into mud.
Well, these are all many of these are studio paintings, and they've never been shown before. And there's a lot of paint on them, a lot of sessions. Many times they would go for months painting on them. And before our son, John would do long meditative paintings. And our son's arrival on the scene, really, he started doing poke-proof paintings on panel so that he wouldn't have to have a heart attack if Gabe went slamming into one. And he loved how they sat up on the surface. So I believe that one might be on a panel.
Did you have a dog with a big tail?
We did. We always had dogs.
Yeah.
You know, de Kooning was a sign painter when he started. And so some of these fluid, beautiful lines are from having sign painters' brushes. And John was very aware of that and aware of the contrast of big, wide brushes and fluid finesse. So he was definitely playing with that in a bunch of these. And Gorky also had beautiful lines, you know, so it's another reference back.
I'm going to give a little sales pitch for the Courthouse Gallery. If these paintings haven't been shown widely before, museums are going to be really interested in these. These are great paintings. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. I think that these will ultimately end up in major collections, you know, both here and elsewhere. They're wonderful. Mature paintings by an artist at the height of his powers, I think.
He's one of America's great painters.
And you know, I mean, that he can hold a slide with Willem de Kooning and some of the others is pretty much all you need to know. And here's another painting by, in this case, de Kooning in the 1980s. Very loose and open, and one by John.
We love de Kooning's late and somewhat controversial earth, but they're just ribbons of light.
Yeah, you know, it's sort of motor memory with de Kooning. He was at that point, you know, kind of failing in terms of his consciousness of, you know, of memories at least, but he still knew how to paint. And he could still figure out where the colors and lines needed to go. But John's homage to de Kooning is also a marvelous picture.
Yes, And John did another painting called My Attic, which, you know, it's almost like it is a temple. You know, it's like art is just, it's the highest religion almost for people like he and I. And
let's see. And here's Tiger Lily too, with an early Philip Guston. This was Guston when he was an abstract expressionist. And I was telling Jill that he turned to the figurative painting because he got tired of critics and people telling him how beautiful his abstractions were. I mean, he was a natural colorist, and he was accused of being an abstract impressionist at one point. But I think John's painting too picks up on some of that vibrancy that we find in Guston's early work, and that Tiger Lily too, I think, is just a wonderful painting with the Tiger Lily somewhere buried in there, but
it's right behind you.
But the actual flowers. It's these dots here. These Guston dots. I'm a gardener, among other things, and John was always feeling like he was competing with the gardening, and but I would try to seduce him by putting, planting things outside his studio, and he just did marvelous garden paintings from my garden, which he got a lot of mileage out of it.
Yeah, he wasn't a very neat gardener, but,
Excuse me.
but anyway, and just to continue this kind of back and forth, where art comes from, and I have no clue as to whether John even thought about Claude Monet, but again, it's not the image so much, or the subject matter of the water lilies. It's the way he sort of balances things out in the sort of tendrils that sneak down in various ways, and the layering of things. And Monet rightly is considered one of the antecedents of all the abstract expressionists and nature paintings that are current. And I'll just show you another one with Lilies and Mums, which is a late painting. Yeah, and not that they're directly related, but what I really wanted you to notice was the Joan Mitchell down below. Joan Mitchell would have been insanely jealous of John's paintings, I have a feeling. And Joan herself, who painted in France and was very enamored of Claude Monet too, is now being recognized as one of the great painters of her generation. Women artists like Joan Mitchell and Grace Hardigan and several others of that generation, including Lynn Drexler, a painting. She was an artist on Monhegan Island. They're coming back into view, and critics and collectors are increasingly interested in.
And if you haven't read 9th Street Women, it's really a great book that gives you the entire context of that art world at that time, instead of deleting the women. The men are in it too, so it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's a brilliant book, a masterpiece.
Lee Krasner was a force of nature. When I was young, I had the opportunity to go visit her and interview her in her studio, and it ended up that we probably couldn't show that particular videotape because the language was so salty, but she was at that point doing paintings where her early work, she would be cutting them up and then collaging them back together and then reworking them in different ways. She was a major artist who hasn't had that. I want to leave some time for some questions, but any?
Oh, I love Joan Mitchell's work, and John always said she'd make a good student, which I was debating whether even to say that out loud here, because it's so come on, John, that was he would, as I said, John had no problem with his ego.
There's a wonderful example in Baltimore.
John Mitchell's work?
Yeah.
No, it's
really, it's clear that she's a rock climber.
And it's in Paris now, and so that's the next. If you haven't seen it and you want to go to Paris,
yeah. I mean, she single-handedly sort of made American art relevant in Europe and vice versa. I mean, she was such a wonderful painter. That painting that's on the lower is huge. It's a triptych, and each panel is like 8 or 9 feet wide, I think. All these women artists of that generation are now totally unaffordable to museums unless you're Crystal Bridges maybe, but and so this is a late self-portrait of John, and the Rembrandt is just kind of for fun. I mean, artist self-portraits are very interesting. The one of Rembrandt is painted when he was about the same age when John painted his portrait, and I'm kind of interested in in the disc behind. It gives
Oh, yeah.
behind John and
Yeah,
Rembrandt.
interesting.
It's kind of
Huh.
almost a celestial
Huh.
thing going on there. But again, I mean, John kind of explored all the different masters of art and art history, and not that he was painting like Rembrandt or was even particularly interested in his work, but I think the late self-portraits are fascinating in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, this one started out as a still life of flowers and this almost caricature of himself. And as it developed, it got more and more somber. And, Carl Schrag did a self-portrait with a moon behind him. And I think that John was thinking about Bonnard also. And there was, and he certainly he did self-portraits early on of himself as young Rembrandt, and both huge and small. So self-portraits were another whole spectrum that followed his
Right.
trajectory as a painter.
So that last year and a half of his life, he was doing portraits of people that he knew for the most part.
Yeah.
He really couldn't go outside anymore. Is that
Right.
part of the problem?
So he did 200 portraits of friends in that last year. It was an awesome.
So he was.
Yeah. And it's always interesting to look at an artist's last body of work. And he really felt that those paintings were masterpiece paintings of his crescendoing development. And, he was in leg braces. Somebody was holding him from behind so he could stand up. He could no longer use his hands. And we would put a paintbrush right here and he would move his hips. And the painting was down here. So a lot of them, the head's at the bottom and there's space at the top. And he would just do these X-ray visions of people. I mean, how he did it. This is what I said, it was just miraculous that he could tap into that river that it transcends the body, and then he would collapse after, that was it. But any ounce of being he had went into those sessions. And usually they'd last about an hour and a half. And then he had a little bit of juice left. He was totally, upped. And so we'd give him a little painting and he'd just do these poems kind of very spare distillations of the session. And they were, and then it was done. Yeah.
So let's maybe wind up with this painting, which is called Swirl, which is right there, I think, isn't it? Yeah. And, I was driving myself nuts trying to write about John's work. I mean, it's so sophisticated and difficult and layered, I think. But I ran across a quote by John Yao, who's a critic I particularly admire, a poet as well. And he was writing about another artist who was also a kind of a late bloomer and coming to abstraction late in his life. And what he said about Norman Bloom was the artist, I think applies to John's work. It fits him almost like a new bride's wedding dress. I mean, but let me just, John Yao said, talking about this artist, Norman Bloom work, is there was this unshakable belief that painting could be joyful, uplifting, exuberant as a great piece of music. And I think that absolutely applies to certainly the abstract paintings. And he goes on to say, there is a commitment to evoking an alternative world that seems to be in constant motion, at once central and whimsical, carnal, and cloud-like. It is a layered world in which forms frolic and cavort as they slide past, over, and under each other, a surface in which line, form, and gesture mingle while figure and ground exchange identities. And Jon is one of the great writers on art that we have today. But I think he says that he could be writing about these paintings for sure. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great little painting.
Yeah, it's a, in that way that you can just milk a few places for such amounts of exploration, and that this hill was one. There were other places. Jon had a few places on Deer Isle. He just liked to know, I'm going back to the Dow Ledges. I'm going back to Windswept. I'm going back to Bob and Cleo's ledges. He got just tremendous variety out of these places. Yeah, Bill.
What do you think, because many artists do those touchstone places that they go to, what do you think, or actually especially for both of you, what do you think that is about? What's,
I think usually there's, like for me, there's structure. I go for structure and a kind of profundity of depth of a place. And I think I showed Jon most of these places and introduced him to them. And he found they're pretty infinite place. Maine is an amazing place to work as a painter, and all the greats have come here to try themselves against it. So if you're lucky enough to have a deep relationship with Maine, it comes out. And I think in Jon's case, it was certainly, these are powerful places. So I could say, structure, rhythm, composition, it just had it all the stuff that makes for a good, great painting.
Yeah, it kind of occurs to me too that you guys were working down in Stonington. There is no place on the coast that's more real than that, I think, and has nurtured any number of artists. But you and Jon, I think, really nailed it down there. And one of the things I didn't say earlier is that you are responsible for getting him to pay attention to Maine. He'd been coming up here, but it was not his.
1971 with Phil Allen, his best friend, who was a big part of his dialogue. They were, way like Matisse and Picasso. They were always like trying to outdo each other, and that's. Oh, and Jon and I had very parallel developmental influences. I was a figurative narrative painter. He was too, before we met one another. But our work is so different and our approaches are so different that in that case, there wasn't competition because we totally approached it in different ways. Yet he was very open to dialogue, visual dialogue, and it was a very exciting team give and take of constantly critiquing each other, saying, well, I really think you should do this. And he liked being with me, so he started going out and being a plein air painter, and he had never done that before. And it just, he loved it. I mean, if you explore what he did with that, it's really a whole world.
You did a wonderful tour of an exhibition that was at the Cove Street Gallery, and it's still out there. If you Google it, Google it, and you just move from painting to painting, and it's quite wonderful. And you talk a little bit about your relationship and how things were different, in terms of your artistic sensibilities, but how you really came together and kind of challenged each other and informed each other. I mean, I think that's a relationship you don't find often in the art world, I have to say. It's quite unique.
And I often say, I wish I had the 40 paintings underneath these paintings, that Jon had a really hard time letting go of a painting. He was always like, well, what would happen if I push this? And he was very courageous painter in terms of just re-entering. And this back one, it had been a whole painting in it of this spot, and he reworked it maybe 10 years later. And this is the painting. I wish I had the first painting to show you what it was then, which I don't. So before I met Jon, when he first started doing these huge landscapes, he would come up after he taught at Harvard or visual arts, or he taught at RISD, and he would spend time in Maine doing pastel paintings that he would then take back to the studio and work into these huge landscapes. And pastel dust is pigment. It's really not good for you. And so once we had a child, he pretty much stopped using it because of the dust. He did re-enter it again at different intervals. And his pastels are amazing. They're not like anybody else's. And they're so rhythmic and so about drawing, and they're wonderful explorations. So it very much fed his painting, and he used them referentially, and they're fabulous in and of themselves.
Yeah, the Farnsworth has one, which I was surprised to find. And I think it's misdated. It says 2013. I don't think that it's called Sunset.
I think it's misstated.
Yeah.
Maybe 2002. I'll have to look at it.
Yeah, not to show it to you. But the other thing about the pastels is it's such a fragile medium. You can't even breathe on it until it's been, fixed and all of that. And, the artists who use pastel were artists like Degas, who was trying to capture movement, dance. And I think Imber's paintings, pastels, the few I've seen have that quality too. They're about the transitory nature of nature.
Yeah.